Hey, this is Mark Hutten, and welcome to the Cassandra Syndrome podcast. Today, we're going to look at loneliness inside marriage, the grief no one talks about. So, before we begin today, I want to acknowledge something important. That loneliness inside marriage is one of the most painful experiences a human being can have, and one of the least talked about. So, if you're listening to this while sitting next to your husband, or while lying awake in bed after another quiet evening, or while going about your day, functioning on the outside and unraveling on the inside, you're not weak for feeling this way. You're responding to something real, and most of the listeners are neurotypical wives married to a husband on the autism spectrum, and in no way do I want to make you believe that somehow I think your husband is defective or flawed or a bad person. I'm sure he's a very good person, but he has some blind spots due to the traits of ASD. So today we're talking about loneliness inside the marriage and why it hurts so deeply and why it often turns into depression and why so many women blame themselves for it. So before we go further, I'd like for you to pause with me for just a little bit. Gently place your feet on the floor. Now notice the chair or couch supporting you. And take a slow, deep breath in and let it out slowly. You don't need to brace yourself here. You're allowed to soften, okay? Okay. Nice deep breath. The questions in this episode came from women who said things like, I feel embarrassed admitting this, and I don't even know how to explain what I'm missing. So if you hear your story in these questions, you're not alone. So, by the way, I have summarized these questions. The first one is, how can I feel this lonely when I am married? Well, because emotional loneliness has nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with connection. You can, share a home, a bed, children, routines, responsibilities, and so on, and still feel deeply alone when your inner world has no witness. So in many neurodiverse marriages, conversations stay practical, emotional moments pass without response, pain is met with silence, logic, or discomfort from your ASD husband. There's no shared emotional space, and over time, that marriage becomes just functional but not relational. In other words, the two of you function a particular way, but there's not emotional reciprocity involved. And the loneliness you feel isn't imagined, it's the grief of missing emotional presence. So, having heard that, if you feel a heaviness in your chest right now, just notice it. The heaviness isn't weakness, it's longing, and longing tells the truth. So some of this information in these podcasts are hard to hear. So, okay, another deep breath. One listener wrote, I feel lonelier married than I ever felt single, and that scares me. And so here's some questions related to that phenomenon right there. So question 2 from one of the ladies on this channel, and feel free to comment underneath this video too with your questions, and it'll be in the next podcast. She asks, why does this loneliness hurt so much? And the answer is because your nervous system is wired for emotional attunement. As a neurotypical woman, your body expects emotional responsiveness, shared meaning, empathy during distress, and being emotionally held during hard moments. You may not be getting that from an ASD husband. So when those needs go unmet repeatedly, your nervous system just experiences as we'll just call it attachment threat. This is why loneliness doesn't feel mild or manageable, it feels existential. It's not just, I wish things were better, it's something essential is missing, and I don't know how to survive without it. So, if that little verbiage right there feels intense, Slow your breathing. Inhale gently through your nose again. Exhale through your mouth a little longer. Your body is responding normally to emotional deprivation. And I'm going to throw in some of these little grounding moments throughout, because I would like for this not just to be some kind of educational thing or a series of bad news. I want this to also be kind of meditative and relaxing for you as well as we work through this together. Several women asked this question with a lot of guilt. And again, I have summarized these questions. Question number 3 is, why do I feel guilty for being lonely? Isn't that a hell of a note, feeling guilty for being lonely? Have you ever done that? Well, because you've been taught that gratitude should cancel pain. Yes, you've been taught that gratitude should cancel pain. You may think, I should be grateful he's not abusive. Other people have it worse. He provides, he tries, he means well. Other people like him. He walks fine, works fine, talks fine, has friends. But gratitude and grief can coexist. You can appreciate what exists and still mourn what doesn't. Loneliness becomes shameful only when your pain is repeatedly minimized by others or by yourself. So, another grounding moment here. If you've been silencing yourself with shoulds, I shouldn't be feeling that way, I should be doing this instead, then pause right here and say gently to yourself with me right now, both my gratitude and my grief are allowed. Okay. Another listener asked something that many women are afraid to say out loud, but we're going to talk about it now, and that's question 4. Why do I feel emotionally abandoned? And that's just a summary of a very long question, but that's the essence of her question. And the answer is because emotional abandonment doesn't require leaving. You can feel abandoned, and he's right there next to you. So emotional abandonment happens when your emotions aren't noticed, when your distress doesn't evoke care from your ASD spouse, when your inner world goes unacknowledged, when you feel alone in moments that really should be shared with somebody else. So in neurodiverse marriages, this abandonment is often passive and unintentional coming from your ASD spouse. But that doesn't make it less painful. You may even have the thought, yeah, there's no malicious intent coming from him, he just has blind spots. Well, that's true, but the pain is still there. Your heart experiences absence the same way regardless of intent. Now, if you felt alone in moments when you most needed comfort, let that truth be acknowledged right here. You don't need to justify it. So here's question 5 that's been summarized. Why is my loneliness turning into depression? Well, that's usually because unresolved loneliness eventually collapses inward. At first, loneliness feels like sadness, longing, hope that things will change. But over time, when connection doesn't come, your nervous system stops reaching for it. That's when loneliness becomes emotional numbness or hopelessness, helplessness, fatigue, loss of motivation, a shrinking sense of self. So depression in this context isn't a chemical flaw, like you don't have enough serotonin or something. It's a relational injury. So if you have felt flat, empty, or disconnected, let's pause right here. That's not failure, that's exhaustion. Okay? Now, one commenter on the YouTube channel asked this question. Why can't I just accept this and move on? I get that question a lot. Because acceptance without emotional nourishment feels like self-abandonment. Let me rephrase that. Acceptance without emotional nourishment feels like self-sabotage, or that something is being erased. You may have tried lowering expectations, staying busy, focusing on the kids, numbing out, telling yourself this is just how it is, this is how my life is going to go, I didn't sign up for this marriage, but I'm stuck in it anyway, and so on and so on. But your attachment system doesn't just shut off because logic tells it to. You can adapt, but adaptation has a cost, and that cost is often losing yourself. So, if you feel tired of trying to adjust, let that be honored. Right here. You've been bending for a long time. Next question. Is it okay to admit I miss being emotionally close to someone? Well, yes, of course. Missing emotional intimacy doesn't make you disloyal, it makes you honest. So you're not longing for drama, you're longing for shared emotional presence, and you're not getting that from the ASD spouse. Not because he doesn't want to give you that. He has emotional blindness and mind blindness and doesn't really have the social and emotional intelligence to deliver. And that longing is not a betrayal of your marriage. It's information about what your heart needs. Hey, this is Mark Hutten, and welcome to today's podcast. And the title of this podcast is going to be, When You Feel Alone in Your Marriage, Real Answers for Wives Living with Cassandra Syndrome. So if you're listening to this and wondering, is it just me? I want you to know right now, it is not just you. Many women in neurodiverse marriages live with a quiet kind of grief. You're married but emotionally alone. You talk but feel unheard. You reach but there's no response. You may have been told by your ASD husband that you're too sensitive, too emotional, too needy, or worse, that you're imagining things. So this podcast is for the neurotypical wife who's exhausted from explaining herself, who's aching for emotional connection, and who's slowly disappearing inside the relationship. So today I'm going to read some real questions that I've got from various emails and comments underneath my videos from women just like you. And I'm going to try to give honest, grounded answers that name what's actually happening and what you can do next. So without further ado, first question is, why do I feel so lonely when I'm married? Well, that's usually because emotional loneliness is not the same as physical loneliness. In other words, you can share a house, a bed, children, finances, and so on, and still feel profoundly alone when emotional reciprocity is missing. So in many marriages affected by ASD, and we're talking about ASD level 1, I'm sure your husband is highly intelligent, general IQ-wise, has high logical intelligence, and so on. But having said that, most marriages affected by ASD level 1, the emotional signals aren't picked up by your ASD husband. Empathy doesn't show up in the ways that you would expect as a neurotypical wife. Conversations stay factual and logistical and problem-focused and so on. And your inner world goes unseen. Now we're talking about mind blindness and emotions blindness stuff there. So over time, this creates what I call relational starvation. You have to have relationship and emotional reciprocity. It's not an option. It's right up there with water, food, shelter, and so on. And I'm not saying your husband doesn't have any emotions, but he could go all year and not talk about emotions. So your nervous system as a neurotypical wife is wired for emotional attunement, not just coexistence. So when your bids for connection are repeatedly missed, ignored, or misunderstood, your body interprets that as abandonment. And why wouldn't it? Even if your husband has no intention of abandoning you. So your loneliness is not a character flaw, it's a biological and emotional response to unmet attachment needs. We got another question here. Why does he act like my feelings are an inconvenience or a problem to solve? Okay, well, if he's like most of the other ASD husbands I work with, this is because he likely experiences emotions as data, not shared experience. Many autistic men are not emotionally avoidant, they are emotionally literal. In other words, they look for cause, solution, and fix. But when you share feelings, you're not asking for a solution in most cases, you're just asking for presence. But here's the painful gap that goes on there. You speak in emotion, he listens for information. So when he offers logic, advice, or defensiveness, it can still feel dismissive, even though in his mind he's trying to be helpful, right? And this mismatch becomes devastating over time Because emotional validation is not optional for neurotypical wives. It's essential. Next question here. I feel invisible. Is this emotional neglect? So that's an interesting. So is invisibility technically emotional neglect? I would say yes. And naming it for what it is, I think, is important. So emotional neglect doesn't always look like cruelty, right? Sometimes it looks like forgetting important emotional moments, maybe not asking follow-up questions, failing to notice distress until it's so extreme that, a 2-year-old child would notice it, responding neutrally to your pain. So intent does not erase impact. You can acknowledge autism and acknowledge emotional neglect at the same time. Both can be true, and your pain doesn't need permission to exist. That's what I have to say about that. Next question. Why am I anxious and depressed all the time now? Okay, well, you and about every other Cassandra syndrome sufferer out there. That's because your nervous system has been living in chronic emotional uncertainty for how many years? How many decades? So when emotional connection is inconsistent or absent, which it usually is to some degree or another when you're married to an autistic husband, you begin to second guess yourself. You scan signs of rejection. You probably over-explain or over-accommodate or over-function. You may suppress your needs to keep peace. And this leads to anxiety, hypervigilance, depression, hopelessness, loss of self, emotional exhaustion, and that's the short list. But this is not weakness. This is what happens when attachment needs go unmet for too long. Great question. Moving on here. When I try to explain how lonely I am, he gets defensive or shuts down. Why? Okay, well, that sounds very familiar. Because your pain sounds like an accusation to his nervous system, and he processes that literally. Think of it like this. Autistic shutdown is not manipulation, it's overload. That doesn't mean, that you should stop expressing yourself. It means communication must change form, though, not necessarily disappear. So instead of saying, let's come up with an example, you might say, you never care about how I feel. You may want to try something along the lines of, when I share something emotionally and don't get a response, my body experiences loneliness. I'm not blaming you, I'm explaining my experience. So that still doesn't necessarily guarantee change on his end, but it does reduce misinterpretation a bunch of the time. Okay? Great question. Next one. Is it wrong that I need emotional intimacy? No, of course not. It's human. But, people have been suffering from Cassandra syndrome for so long, they begin to wonder if I'm just too emotionally needy. Am I being unreasonable? So no, you're not asking too much. You're asking for what marriage typically promises. The real question here is not whether your needs are valid, but whether your husband is able, willing, and supported enough to meet them in some form. And if not, then you need some other kind of support outside of the marriage. I'm not talking about cheating or divorce or separation or anything like that. But you need, if this is what you're experiencing, you need some support, not just silence coming from him. Next question. What if I've lost myself trying to make this marriage work? Well, that would be right in tune with all the other Cassandra syndrome sufferers. They feel like they have lost a part of themselves. And if this is going on, then it's time to stop abandoning yourself. Many neurotypical wives that I work with, they become translators, emotional regulators, the meltdown managers, lone adults in the marriage. They're with somebody who is a solo player who just happens to be married. So you may have shrunk, quieted, numbed, or adapted beyond recognition. But healing becomes when you recenter yourself, and what I mean by that is your reality matters, your pain is real, your needs deserve space, so you don't have to leave to reclaim yourself, but you do have to stop disappearing. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to go on here to the next one. What should I focus on right now? Well, that's the question I like to hear, because that That kind of question gets you unstuck from the past. So 3 things, no more, no less really. Here's what you should focus on right now. Validation is number 1. Stop questioning whether your pain is real enough. The second one would be support. You can't do this alone. You need outside emotional mirrors. And the third and final would be boundaries. Not necessarily ultimatums, but emotional self-protection. So you're not broken, you're not weak, you basically just responded normally to an abnormal emotional environment. I know this isn't the marriage that you signed up for, but at risk of sounding like I'm trying to defend your ASD husband, he didn't sign up for autism either. You've been dealt a poor poker hand, and what we want to do now is figure out how to play this poker hand, this very poor poker hand, the best way that I can. So if no one has told you this yet, let me be the first one. Your loneliness makes sense, your grief is real, and your voice deserves to be heard. So whether your marriage evolves, stabilizes, or changes direction, you matter in this story. You don't have to choose between compassion for your husband and compassion for yourself. There's room for both. Is autism a form of emotional abuse? Some NTYs, especially those suffering from Cassandra syndrome, might say, yeah, maybe. So this is kind of like one of the hardest questions you'll ever ask yourself. Is it autism or is it abuse? So let's look at capacity versus choice. Autism changes capacity. It changes how a brain processes emotion, how it reads cues, how it tolerates stress. So it can mean your ASD husband truly struggles to notice tone, facial expressions, or the emotional meaning behind your words. And this is not cruelty, that's wiring. Abuse is about choice. Somebody who's going to be abusive, they choose to do that. It's the deliberate use of power, control, or humiliation to dominate another person. So when you're trying to sort out which one you're living with, don't just ask why something happened, ask what happens next. Don't just ask why something happened, ask what happens next. If someone can't do something, you'll see confusion and often remorse. If they won't, you'll see defensiveness, blame, or entitlement. So let's make that real. If your ASD partner forgets to respond to your text because maybe he was hyper-focused, that's capacity. If he read it, ignored it, and later said, "You're so needy," that's choice. So capacity deserves patience, choice demands boundaries. When you're living in a fog of confusion as someone suffering from Cassandra syndrome, the mind keeps trying to explain things away. So I tell my ladies in the Cassandra syndrome recovery group, stop explaining and start recording. Write down what happened, how it made you feel, and what happened after. You're not building a case against your ASD husband, you're building clarity for you. So here's what to look for. Does the behavior stop once the stress ends? Okay, well that's overload. Or does it continue after calm with no awareness, no repair, no ownership? Okay, well that's control. A meltdown ends with recovery. Abuse ends with repetition. So if your ASD partner apologizes, takes small responsibility, and tries again differently, well, that's progress. We want that. If you're blamed for their behavior, look at what you made me do, he says. That's manipulation, and that's not okay. After every rupture, something should move towards healing. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be clumsy, a small act of service, a note, a question like, "Are you okay?" That's repair. It's the nervous system saying, "I still care." But when there's never any movement towards repair, only silence, deflection, blame, that's emotional starvation. And starvation isn't love, it's slow death. If you're unsure, try saying, "Hey, I love you, but I can't keep being hurt this way. I need to see some consistent change." Then step back and watch the behavior, not the promises. Change is seen in small daily respect, not in panicky apologies. If you ever feel afraid in your own home, believe your body. It's telling you the truth. You don't need a diagnosis to justify protecting yourself. Create a safety plan, someone you can text, a phrase that means "I need help," a friend you can stay with. Safety isn't drama, it's wisdom. And if what you're feeling isn't fear, but deep emotional exhaustion, then create space. Take a walk. Go quiet when the conversation turns cruel. Rest before explaining. You're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to exist beyond the chaos. Now, let's talk about holding both truths. You can hold two truths at once. Your ASD spouse might be neurodivergent, and you might still be profoundly wounded. You can understand why he struggles and still decide that his struggle can't keep you defining your safety. That's not abandonment, that's adulthood. It's the hardest kind of love, the kind that finally includes you. Hey, this is Mark, and in today's podcast, we're going to answer the question for all the NTYs out there with Cassandra syndrome. Am I too sensitive or am I emotionally starving? So many women that I work with say some version of this. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I cry more than I used to. So if you found yourself feeling more emotional, more reactive, more fragile than you remember being in times past, then this podcast is for you. Being told, perhaps by your ASD husband, that you're too sensitive can slowly dismantle your self-trust. And over time, that message can hurt more than the loneliness itself. So today we're going to talk about emotional sensitivity versus emotional starvation and how one often gets mistaken for the other. Now, before we go further, I want you to take a deep breath. Notice where your body is supported. Notice that you're here listening, trying to understand yourself. That effort matters. Just a moment to be grounded. Okay. Now, the question in this episode came from women who were basically afraid they might actually be the problem. So if that fear feels familiar, you're in the right place. So let's look at the first question that has been summarized. It basically went like this: why do I feel more sensitive now than I used to? Well, the answer is because prolonged emotional deprivation heightens emotional reactivity. When emotional needs go unmet over time, your nervous system becomes hyper alert, not because you're fragile, but because connection has been uncertain. Small moments start carrying heavy meaning. For example, a neutral tone feels rejecting, silence feels like abandonment, missing bids feel devastating. This isn't sensitivity, it's emotional hunger, and hunger always intensifies the response to scarcity. If this describes you, pause right here and say gently to yourself, my reactions are telling a story. My reactions are telling a story. Now, several women asked this next question with a lot of shame. And again, this question has been summarized. Why does he say I'm overreacting? Okay, because he's responding to volume, not context. Your spouse on the autism spectrum often assesses emotional situations based on observable intensity, immediate logic, and efficiency. He doesn't automatically register the history behind your emotions. So when years of unmet needs pour out in one moment, he sees an overreaction while you're expressing accumulated pain. The issue isn't exaggeration, it's compression. So let's take another grounding moment. If you've been minimizing yourself to avoid being seen as too much, pause right here. You're not too much. But here's what is going on. You're carrying a very heavy load. Another listener wrote, I used to be calm, now I feel like I'm unraveling. And here's a question related to that general mindset. Why do I feel like I'm losing emotional control? Okay, because emotional regulation requires emotional safety. When your inner world is consistently unseen, your nervous system stays activated. This leads to tears that come easily, irritability, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, a sense of internal chaos. You're not regressing, you are depleted. Now, self-regulation isn't something you fail at. It's something that erodes when support is absent. Now, another grounding moment. If you feel overwhelmed, bring your attention to your breath right now. Nothing needs to be solved right now. Okay. Many women asked this next question quietly, almost afraid of the answer. How do I know if my needs are reasonable? Okay. Well, a need is reasonable if it's about emotional safety, if it involves being seen and responded to, and if it does not require someone to become a different person. So listen, wanting empathy during distress, wanting emotional presence, wanting responsiveness, wanting mutual care is not excessive. What is unreasonable is expecting yourself to thrive without emotional nourishment. Another grounding moment here. If you've been measuring your needs against his capacity instead of your humanity, pause right here. Breathe. Your needs don't need permission. Okay, several listeners asked some version of this next question. Why do I feel needy and ashamed for wanting connection? Well, the answer is because emotional starvation gets mislabeled as neediness and clinginess. When connection is inconsistent, the nervous system reaches harder, seeks reassurance, amplifies emotional signals, and from the outside, this can look like neediness. But from the inside, it's survival. But shame enters when your natural responses are repeatedly invalidated. Now, one listener asked this next question with a lot of fear. What if I am really too sensitive? Okay, well, first of all, sensitivity is not a defect. It's responsiveness to emotional information. So the problem isn't sensitivity. The problem is being sensitive in an emotionally barren environment. Even the healthiest nervous system struggles when emotional cues go unanswered. So your sensitivity isn't the issue. It's the context it exists in. Another grounding moment. If you've been trying to harden yourself, pause right now. Breath. You don't need to become less human to survive. The next question, which I have summarized, is this: what should I do with my emotions now? Okay. You want to start believing them, not necessarily acting on them, not explaining them, not suppressing them, just acknowledging something in me needs care. Emotions are instructions, they're information, and right now your emotions are telling you something important. So if you've been told you're too sensitive, you're whiny, clingy, let me offer a different perspective. What if you're not sensitive, but you're starving? What if your tears are signals, not flaws? What if your emotions are asking for honesty, not suppression? Hey, this is Mark, and welcome to today's podcast. Today we're going to talk about why talking makes things worse and what's really happening. Many women told us they feel confused by this one. The more they try to talk things through, the worse everything seems to get. Have you ever experienced that? So, if you've ever thought, if I could just explain better, or if I could just find the right words, or if he could just understand how much this hurts, and yet every conversation leaves you feeling more alone, more discouraged, more misunderstood, well, this episode is for you. So today we're talking about why communication breaks down, not because you're doing it wrong necessarily, but because something deeper is happening beneath the conversation. So before we get started, let's have a grounding moment. I'd like for you to pause for a breath. Let your shoulders drop if they want to. Notice that you're not in the conversation right now, you're just listening. You don't need to prepare or defend yourself here. Okay. The questions in this episode came from women who said something along the lines of, every talk ends in silence, shutdown, or defensiveness, and I don't know why. So if that feels familiar, you're not alone. So here's question 1, and this has been summarized. Why does every emotional conversation end badly? Well, the answer is because you and your ASD husband are often having 2 different conversations at the same time. You know, you're speaking from emotion, meaning, history, accumulated pain, but he may be hearing criticism, failure, a problem to fix, an expectation he can't meet. So while you're trying to connect, his nervous system may be bracing, and the result isn't resolution, it's overload. So another grounding moment here. If this brings up frustration, let's pause right now. This isn't because you're bad at communicating. It's because the emotional languages don't match. Deep breath. One listener wrote, I rehearse what I want to say for days and still it goes nowhere. Okay. Here's our next question, which has been summarized. Why doesn't explaining it better help? Well, the answer is because clarity doesn't resolve capacity limits. We're talking about capacity limit in your ASD husband. You may be choosing your words carefully, you're staying calm, you're giving examples, you're trying not to blame. But if your ASD husband struggles to process emotional information in real time, more explanation increases cognitive load. That doesn't increase understanding. So what feels like clarity to you can feel like pressure to him, and pressure leads to shutdown. You've been living it. Okay, let's have another grounding moment. Breath. If you feel tired just hearing this, notice that. That tiredness reflects how much effort you've already put in. Now, many women asked some version of this next question. Here's question number 3 that has been summarized. Why does he get defensive when I talk about my feelings? Well, because feelings often sound like judgment to a literal nervous system, which your ASD husband has. Even statements like, well, I feel lonely, or I feel unseen, or I need more connection, can be interpreted by him as, you're failing, you're doing something wrong, you're being blamed. So defensiveness isn't always refusal, it's often self-protection. That doesn't mean your feelings are wrong. It means the emotional message is being translated differently. So if you've been softening, shrinking, or filtering your feelings to avoid defensiveness, let's pause right here. Your truth matters, even if it's hard to hear. Another listener wrote, he shuts down, I panic. That takes us to question number 4 that has been summarized. Why does his shutdown feel so devastating? Because shutdown feels like abandonment to you. It feels like abandonment to an attachment-oriented nervous system. So when he goes quiet, disengages, or retreats, your body doesn't experience neutrality. It experiences disconnection. It experiences loss. So your nervous system escalates, seeking reassurance, response, or repair, and that escalation often deepens the shutdown. This creates a panic cycle. You reach, he withdraws, you panic, he shuts down more. Now, if you recognize this pattern, let's pause again. Deep breath. You're not needy. You're responding to disconnection. Now, several women asked some version of this next question with a lot of self-doubt. Here's question 5. Should I just stop talking about my feelings? Well, not exactly. But how and when you talk about your feelings does matter. Silencing yourself leads to resentment and loss of self. Constant emotional pursuit leads to burnout. The goal isn't silence or pressure. it's self-containment. This means not processing everything with your ASD spouse, choosing emotional safety over emotional urgency, building outside emotional supports, recognizing when conversations aren't productive. So talking less isn't giving up, it's conserving yourself. Now, if this feels relieving instead of sad, pay attention. That relief is information. Now, one listener asked this question with a lot of pain. Why do I feel rejected even when he says he's not rejecting me? Because emotional rejection is felt, not reasoned. Words don't override experience. You may hear from him, "I'm not trying to hurt you," but your body registers no response, no comfort, no attunement. And the nervous system believes what it experiences, not what it's told. That doesn't make you irrational, it makes you embodied. Now, if you've been telling yourself you shouldn't feel rejected, let's pause right here. Breath. Your feelings don't need approval to exist. Question 7. What should I do instead of trying to talk it out? Okay, start by shifting from persuasion to protection. Instead of asking, "How do I make him understand me?" begin asking, "How do I keep myself emotionally steady?" And that may include shorter, clearer communication. It might include lower emotional exposure, maybe processing feelings elsewhere, setting internal boundaries, letting go of being understood in every moment. Understanding isn't the same as healing. Now, if you've been exhausting yourself trying to communicate, I want you to hear this. You didn't fail. You weren't unclear. You weren't asking too much. You were trying to meet your emotional needs in the system that couldn't consistently hold them. If you are a neurotypical wife in a marriage with an ASD level 1 husband, and you feel like you're suffering from Cassandra syndrome, then there's going to be a link below this video in the description area and also pinned in the comment section that will take you to my Cassandra syndrome recovery group. We meet 1 hour a week for 4 weeks. I hope to see you in that group.
She's been crying words that no one seems to hear, building bridges made of silence year by year. Her heart is heavy, but it still beats strong, whispering to herself, "You've been seen all along." Though the nights feel colder, though the road feels long, there's a light inside her that keeps burning on. This is a song of hope for the ones who feel alone, for the voices left unheard inside their own home. Dawn is still coming at the end of the day. You are worthy, you are seen, you are more than enough. This is your song of hope, this is your song of love. She's been carrying dreams that no one understands, reaching out for comfort with trembling hands. But every tear she's cried has watered the ground, and from that broken soil new strength will be found. There's a chorus rising from the quiet pain, voices find for the ones who feel alone, for the voices left